John Summers is the motoring historian. He was a company car thrashing technology sales rep that turned into a fairly inept sports bike rider. Hailing from California, he collects cars and bikes built with plenty of cheap and fast, and not much reliable. On his show, he gets together with various co hosts to talk about new and old cars, driving, motorbikes, motor racing, and motoring travel.
Have you seen that movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey?
Yes, I have.
You know, the Black Rock where the monkeys are like, ooh, 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 with the... That's me with technology.
It's like the IT crowd where the internet is in the box with the blinking light.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, it is directly related to what we're going to talk about tonight, because I've been down this Group B rat hole for the last however many hours. All I've done is watch Group B rallying videos. And what I'm struck by is how fast the technological changes came.
Yeah.
You basically had today's world rally car competing against Steve and Mike in an Escort Mark II they'd prepared in Mark's dad's.
Yeah, in his shed.
That's been my learning. The changes were incremental, but the increments were so incredibly fast that organizers just did not keep up with it. In other words, from a 270 horse Opel Ascona 400 in 1982 at the beginning of Group B to 320 horse for the first Audis, and I've heard different figures and you're probably better informed than me, but that's a big jump. And there's the jump around traction as well. But early on there was the unreliability, and you know, the first year of Group B. Well, should we actually do an intro here?
I think we should, because we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which I often feel completely alone in the world with respect to rally. And it's, I think, one of the probably the most interesting disciplines of motorsport, maybe one of the most divisive when we really dig deep into the golden era of rally, which is Group B.
I'm really keen to do this, Eric. Let me do my traditional beginning of the episode. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to The Motoring Historian with John Summers and with Eric, his producer. Eric, there are two British comedians called the Two Ronnies. One of them was fat and funny, and the other one was little and not so funny. And the little one would always do a talk to the camera. And it always used to be very boring to me when I was a small boy about Ollie's age, watching it just because I wanted to stay up and not go to bed, as you want to do when you're a small boy. And he would always tell a story sitting in his chair where he was like, the producer said this and the producer said that. And I was like, who the fuck is this producer character? Is it his wife? And it was only when I got involved in TV stuff that I was aware that there was always a producer there. And, you know, in the world of reality TV, each star has their own producer, right? If the star gets cut from the show, the producer loses their income as well. So the production team is structured so that they wind up the reality TV stars to do the absurd things that they do. And we only see one side of the equation. The Sistine Chapel. Do you know who paid Michelangelo to paint that? It was the Pope. So that image on the Sistine Chapel where there's all the completely inappropriate, is this, what am I actually looking at here on the wall of a church stuff that Michelangelo painted that was a direct dig at the Pope? He was biting the hand that fed him. And I use that metaphor with the Sistine Chapel on purpose, right? That behind the artist, there's always the financier is what I'm trying to say. And look, we're going to talk about Group B Rally today, and we're going to take it from a perspective that we're going to set the scene a little bit. Then we're going to talk about the cars a little bit, because, you know, these are the power behind the throne, right? The Pope. Vatanen is not Vatanen without a really decent rally car.
It is said that Group B Rally was more popular than Formula One at the time.
That wasn't what I witnessed in period. What there was a capture of the zeitgeist, right?
Right.
People who wouldn't turn on the TV to watch a Formula One race, but people who were just like, you know, Pamplona running of the Bulls types those were the types who came from the farms and who would stand at the side of the road in stupid places.
Yes,
I'm
and
not
we'll
saying
get
they're
to that.
real rally fans, because I was nearly run over by Bruno Sabi one time because I was standing in a stupid place. Sorry, Bruno. But, it's a really short period, right? It's 82 to 86. So it's a very short period. And in that period, the spectacle is incredible. The danger was palpable to everybody there. The cars spat fire. For God's sake, I won't fall down that rat hole. I won't do an aside now. I'll stay on course somewhat. So this fascinating thing with Group B is that it has resonated in a way that, my God, this Group B stuff, it is hot as you like, isn't it? And that's why I felt like it was worth talking about it. So look, our title today is related to the presentation that I promised I would give at the IMRRC, and I dare say will appear in a future episode. So by the time you're listening to this, that might have been published, and then you yourself can see how well I've interpreted what Eric and I talk about, how well I've turned that into what I present at the IMRRC, which is the real history.
I think this is going to be absolutely entertaining, but I feel underdressed today. Like I don't have enough Quattro paraphernalia. I have a ton in the house. I just wanted to keep it subtle. I have no bias for this. So if you're watching this behind the scenes on Patreon, you'll understand what we're talking about.
See, with me, not only do you get Rembrandt's Night Watch, but you also get all the sketches as well. I always like to go for the jugular with this stuff. Everyone wants to know who the greatest driver was, so you have to talk about that. But we can't talk about that without talking about the cars, and we can't talk about that without talking about the actual canvas, the actual backdrop against which these events took place, because that seems to me really important. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But let's begin at the beginning with that rules package of what Group B really means.
So the rules are very strange because early Group B was all about homologation cars. And around 1983, when the horsepower numbers doubled, they became evolution cars. So I think we need to split hairs in terms of the rules package. We're going to talk about Lancia. We're going to talk about Audi. You mentioned the Citroën BX4TC, which was designed to meet Group B regulations. But we also have to look at the cars that carried over prior to Group B. So I'll give a prime example. The Lancia 037 was adopted into Group B, but it was the replacement for the Stratos, which had just exited in 1978, 1979 with Marco Lane behind the wheel. So homologation rules versus the evolution rules. Where that all stems from, we have to go back and talk about Jean-Marie Balestre, who was at the head of World Rally. It wasn't called WRC like it is today, but as part of the FIA, he was at the head of what we would call WRC today. And the pages were mostly blank. As far as he was concerned. When you look back over reports and documentaries that talk about Balestre, they talk about him more as a businessman. He was very coin operated. He could have cared less about racing. It was all about making money for the FIA.
There was a cultural divide between the frustration, both in Formula One, that these British garagistas were winning with these Ford V8s.
100%.
And you know who was winning in rally? Oh, it would have been lovely if it was those Stratos. Yeah, it would have been, wouldn't it? But it wasn't. It was those fucking Fords again, wasn't it?
It was.
So there was this frustration. I learned this just last night. The rules were developed in partnership with the manufacturer.
Yes.
So just like in Formula One, the turbos were a deliberate attempt to destabilize the British hegemony, if you will.
Yeah.
That at least is one argument that you could make. I'm not trying to make it, but it just occurred to me, how come the Metro 6R4 wasn't turbocharged? How come when Malcolm Wilson was interviewed in the rally that he does in a Quattro, he moans about turbo lag when the Metro 6R4 is not laggy? Oh, I guess there was a lot of politics lurking even behind the technical decisions that were made.
There was, and the Metro 6R4 falls into the evolution period of Group B rather than the homologation period. Though it looked like an MG Metro that was off the street, because that was always the facade. That was that illusion that they wanted to paint.
But one thing, though, Eric, you might not be aware of this, being American and all. Peugeot ran very successful or very memorable advertising campaign. It was in magazines. It was also advertisement hoardings. And it was a picture of a 205 GTI. and then reflected in a puddle at nighttime, and it was like neon lights and the car was black. When reflected in the puddle, it was a T16. So you've got the 205 on the 1.9 GTI alloys, and then in the reflection, you've got the T16 on the rally car wheels. That ad alone lets you know how widely understood, the British public, the viewing public would recognize what was going on here, that was not just a car reflected in the puddle, it was a rally car reflected in the puddle, and it was the rally car that had won everything.
And that's what drove Balestra, was that you would walk into the dealership and buy a Peugeot 205 Rally, but that was a front-wheel drive, front-mount, 100 horsepower GTI type of hatchback versus the Peugeot 205 T16 that you saw on the rally stage. They were selling the dream. They were selling the fantasy. If you think about Formula One at that time, at the same time, yes, in period, Formula One was exciting. You have Senna doing his thing in the rise. You have Andretti clinching his Formula One championship. You have the rivalry, quote unquote, between Pironi and Villeneuve. You have a lot of things happening there. But Formula One couldn't sell the dream the same way that Rally could. So to your point, for the FIA and for Balestra, Rally is the golden child. It's where the money is being made.
It's Indy versus NASCAR.
Exactly.
And in that sense, Balestra is sort of a big bill.
Exactly.
Who knew? Fascinating concept.
So the evolution period of Group E is just absolutely mental. But the thing is, we have to step back to the homologation period. So again, that rules package, as dictated by the FIA, said you have to build 200 cars based on a production vehicle. Oh, okay, well, that's doable. That lasted until 1984.
And for that, I would say the Audi was forward-looking, right?
Yes.
But was still like you could buy a road car. The other Group B cars at that time were stuff that was not so different from, the Escorts of the 1970s.
Opel Manta, all those cars.
The Manta 400 is the key evolution, isn't it? The previous version of the Manta is the Ascona. I now understand, and, the Manta was better balanced and a bit more power, according to Jimmy McRae. But this is fundamentally 270 horse.
Yeah,
and
normally aspirated, but there was a lot of games that were being played by the different manufacturers. It wasn't hard for Audi to crank out 200 cars. I mean, they sent 627 UR Quattros to the United States. They sold 10 times that amount in the United Kingdom alone. So the homologation rules were really strange. And the way they worked was sort of like stock car used to be, where it needed to be based on a production car, just like Trans Am was in the 80s. It needed to be based on the Firebird that you could buy from Chevrolet, and then you could do whatever you wanted with the motor. Even at 300 horsepower, when the Audis hit the scene, that was not what was in the street car. The Audi's 5-cylinder was a 20-valve, 2.1-liter turbo, making somewhere between 275 and 320. The numbers are all over the map. The homologation car made 165 horsepower with a 10-valve turbo. So the homologation rules, you had to have 200 at a minimum production cars sold in dealerships. It didn't matter where it was in the world. And then you could qualify to modify it for WRC. And again, that lasted until 1984. And to your point, the Opel Manta 400 was one of the first cars, but the one that really kind of just punched everybody in the gut was when Audi decided to cut almost 13 inches out of the wheelbase on the Quattro and created the Shorty, or the short wheelbase Quattro, or the Sport Quattro it's referred to. They had to then produce 200 of those for the street, of which they sold 6 in the United States, and then the rest went all over the world. But the Shorty is where you suddenly saw in 1983 and 84, it's like Peugeot, Renault, Lancia, and everybody's going, wait, hold on a second. What do you guys, wait, we're allowed to cut the cars now? This isn't a production chat. What are you doing here? And so now began the period of the evolution cars. And so Balestra stands back and he goes, the fans are loving it. We've got 300,000 people lining the roads in Portugal to watch you crazy bastards go down at 130 miles an hour and hope that nobody gets killed. And so the power numbers continued to increase. It became like a space race.
It's like the Mille in the 50s.
Exactly.
I mean, it was completely an accident waiting to happen. I've watched, as I say, for the last 24 hours, all I've done is watch all of the rally reports from the 1983, 1984, 1985, and 1986 RAC rallies. So that was the lens that I had when I was a boy. I'm just stupefied that when you've got guys like Mikkola saying, you know, the straights are getting shorter and the corners, they are coming quicker. Oh man, it was.
I mean, if you go back to the early days of rally with the Lancia Fulvias and stuff like that, where they did 85 miles an hour downhill if they were lucky. So as we said in the beginning, you know, Group B started in 81 and you had a lot of carryover cars. The Lancia 037 is still in Group B by the rules because they sold homologation versions of it on the street and things like that. But it was based on the Lancia Beta Monte Carlo.
It wasn't really, was it? I mean, I always think Lancia completely took the piss with the designer cars. I always felt like Audi, at least, it vaguely.
Yes.
Whereas Lancia, you were like, what, that, like that Delta S4. I mean, that looked like nothing, like no fucking road car you could ever buy. The Stratos was the beginning. Arguably, the Stratos was the first prototype rally car, although I actually think the Alpine A110 is more of that.
I would agree.
That was sort of positioned as a road car to like slide under the rules. Whereas again, Lancia just completely took the piss and put a Formula One engine in a bespoke chassis. And
well, the Stratos was a Dino 246 motor.
Yeah, it was a Ferrari derived from the engine that bloody Tony Brooks had used to win the 1959 British Grand Prix. You know, really, it was that engine which Lancia invented the V6. Did you know that?
I did know that. Yeah, in the Aurelia, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about events, right? Because that is really, I think, worth talking about. That, you know, for me, I've said in the past that I fell in love with motorsport really through rallying. And it was because rallying made the equivalent of wide world of sport. It was called Grandstand, and rallying made Grandstand. And looking back, it captured the imagination of the British people. So the lens for me is the traditional season ending event, the Lombard RAC Rally of Great Britain. The distinct thing about this event is no pace notes. Every other event you're allowed pace notes for. I guess the striking thing for me is that the season will begin with Monte Carlo, the Monte Carlo rally. So this is snow and ice. They do the one in Finland called the Thousand Lakes, which is when you've seen rally cars jumping. That's where it's going to be. The one in Africa, the Safari Rally, that was always won by local people.
Yep.
Like they wouldn't even send the first time Walter Röhrl. Walter Röhrl had been a rally driver. He'd been world rally champion once before he even went to the Thousand Lakes, because he was like, why would I go there? It's like a pissing competition between these Finns. And I just, you know, I didn't grow up driving these roads. I'm just not going to be a madman to try and, you know, mix it with them. So the events are, from a spectacle perspective, perhaps similar to the way that they are at the moment. But the endurance that was expected of crews is just boggles the mind today.
We have to put it in perspective for those that don't know as much as we do about Group B. So first of all, 1981 to 1986, 12 countries in a season all over the world. To your point, it could be Corsica, it could be Portugal, it could be Kenya, it could be up in Scandinavia. They did over 5,000 kilometers of driving. And this wasn't driving down the highway, down the A1 or the M1. This is 5,000 hard kilometers at breaking speeds.
The 1985 RAC Rally, I learned that from Tuesday night until Thursday morning, the end of the rally, there was 10 hours of halt. So you could expect to get perhaps 5 hours sleep, not counting the time that you can sleep in the passenger seat whilst the co-driver's driving. The route around England in 5 days was 2,000 miles. Vatanen was like, you know, are they trying to do a Paris-Dakar? That did not mix. And this is why I wanted to start out by talking about the events, because that didn't mix with the cars as they were coming along and evolving. Let's talk first about the cars, then we'll talk about the drivers, and then, you know, hopefully come to some kind of conclusion. So clearly these early cars, the Ascona 400, the Renault 5 Turbo, these two-wheel drive things were not competitive as time went on. I watched one event from the British Open Rally Championship from the beginning of 1982. You've got Vatanen fully brain out in an Escort, which has got to have the same horsepower as the Opel Manta.
Mhm.
And you've got Mikkola with a Quattro struggling to come to terms with not knowing the roads as well, the car being understeery, and then bits and pieces breaking on it all the time because it was so many revolutionary technology.
The cars were popular, they were hot, but we also saw them at Geneva in 1980. And they were prototyped in 1979. And so people were already excited about this production car with all-wheel drive, and it's unique and it's different. And
Volkswagen thing it was based on, when did that come out?
so the Iltis, if we go all the way back to World War II,
Oh, all right. Oh, it's right the way back there.
yeah, it comes post World War II.
All the language the British commentators talk about Audi's approach. William Woolard talks about military precision. You know,
Yes.
they're not quite there. British commentators flirt with that kind of thing all the time, very noticeably.
So if we drop the pin all the way back there, you have to realize in World War II, the Germans used the Kubelwagen, which was sold in the United States as the VW Thing. So that was their military Jeep. But remember, it's based on a Beetle. It's rear-wheel drive, rear engine, every problem that a Beetle has, the Kubelwagen had as well. Post-war, when they're still able to develop and refine and this and that, they were building other military vehicles because there were other wars that were happening, right? You had the war in Korea, and later on you had Vietnam and all these kinds of things. So the Iltis was born, and you can look this up. The Volkswagen Iltis, ILTIS, was the first for Volkswagen all-mechanical, all-wheel drive system, punching in the nose other mechanical all-wheel drive systems that existed.
Ahead of the Jeep.
I'd have to look at who did it first, but I will say the Iltis was better because if you look at the trials that they did with the Iltis, that thing could almost climb a vertical wall, right? It's insane how good it was. So they basically lifted that longitudinal design, and they're like, we're going to put that in a production car. And that was the result of the brainchild of Roland Gumpert, who, as we know later, designed his own car company. He was at the head of Audi development for a long time, very famous in German circles.
Piek is team manager, am I correct?
Yes.
Okay, so that's, for people who don't know, that's the dude that did the Porsche 917, the dude that will go on to do the Bugatti Veyron, because, you know, cars are going to be all green in the 21st century. So we need a quad turbo V16, don't we?
Most people will associate Ferdinand Piech with the Volkswagen Phaeton. That was sort of his swan song.
You mean the Bentley Continental?
Yeah, you mean the Audi A8L?
This is why I'm faintly uncomfortable with what Audi and Lamborghini are a wild bull. Bentleys are occasionally faster than them. You can't stack rank them in your nice little German brand thing. No. I rebel.
But all that to say, it is a bit of a coven or a mafia when you think about it, because Audi, Volkswagen, and Porsche have really always been almost in bed together, if you use that analogy. But the thing is, Audi, being the Auto Union, going all the way back to the days of the Silver Arrows, been around for forever, already had a racing pedigree and those kinds of things. And just as an aside, as a footnote, Audi didn't become part of the Volkswagen Audi group officially until 1985. Bear that in mind. They were getting the support because talks were already there and this and that. But Audi was this cutting edge, very different, always thinking outside of the box. One of the biggest problems, having owned many Audis from the 80s and the 90s especially, they used the public as their test bed for new technologies. And it's like, well, it might work, it might not work. They're plagued with electrical gremlins, but the ideas were way ahead of their time.
First car I ever had stop-start on was an Audi 80. On the way to a rugby match, aged about 9 or 10, it completely made up for the fact that I hated rugby. You know, I'd never known a car do that before. I felt the same way about that technology now as I do then, which is that the kind of old Fords my dad had in damp England, when they started, you generally didn't want to turn them off in case they might not want to start again. Early on, right, I think we can say that probably in the very early days of Group B, the best car was not the Audi. As we move through, certainly by 83, you can say very much that it was. But then the moment somebody else did a new car, so when the Peugeot 205 T16 came, that car made the champion. When the Lancia Delta S4 came, that car made the championship. Arguably, the RS200, the Ford, was the next step over that. So I think this whitewash of the question, which car was best, is it depends exactly which year you're asking. Our debate has Audi versus Lancia versus Peugeot.
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying. It's almost like debating the vintages of wines. Is the 71 bottling of Chateau whatever as good as the 72 and the 73? And that's sort of where we're at. And we do have to split hairs because, as you mentioned in the beginning, that technology jumps very, very quickly. But some of it is a bit quid pro quo. Some of it is tit for tat. Some of it is completely reactionary. So I want to highlight the years because it's really important to understand this reaction and why the technology moved. So you mentioned it before. Looking at 1982, you have Hannu Mikkola struggling with the long base Quattro Coupe, and it just understeers like a broken ox cart through every turn, and you can see it. I mean, the amount of wheel deflection and everything that's happening, and having owned a UR Quattro, that polar moment of having that cast iron 5-cylinder hanging out over the front end of that car, that was not the best design from a weight balance proportionally. So that's why it makes sense the mid-engine cars came later. But the thing is, they worked with what they had because that's how the Iltis was laid out. It was front mount, longitudinal with this boat anchor hanging out over the front wheels. So they're like, we're going to keep refining this technology. It's very German. We're going to evolve it until it's perfect. Just look at the 911.
It's incredibly German. It really is yeah.
If you look at the Audi, you're right. They struggled. Every time they won, it was a miracle that they did. And they were getting beat by Vauxhall Chevettes and Talbot would be equivalent to like the Omni.
No, Eric, not the equivalent of the Omni. I just want to. The Omni we got as the Horizon.
Yes.
It was a shortened, narrow version of that with a Lotus twin cam.
Yes.
Which in silver and black, those really look the business. They were a tasty car. And I say that as a committed Ford guy, as a committed, which of the 70s rally cars would I have had? I'd probably have an Escort even now over a Stratos. I would.
So in that mix, you still have Nissan, you have some Toyotas in there, all rear wheel drive layouts. And the reason they were beating the Quattro in the early days, and Quattro did finally show its superiority, is that they could rotate through a corner. And that understeer, that polar moment, that big brick that's up in front of the Audi was its Achilles heel.
Eric, let's call a spade a spade. It looked crap.
Oh,
it looks crap.
It sounds amazing.
Steering your way to victory. Like there's no glory in that.
Yeah.
The glory lies in Ari Vatanen with one wheel in the ditch and all the steering out of the back.
Oh, 100%, 100%.
When he won the RAC Rally in 1984, he was leading the whole event, apart from a few minutes after he had a roll on the last day. You would roll it on the last, like, what?
He was so cavalier about that. He's like, well, that's my weekend. It's over. So Audi's response to getting beat by rear-wheel drive cars, knowing that the all-wheel drive could and would be superior in the long run, they had to make the car pivot somehow. But they couldn't move the motor because the homologation rules said it had to be based on a production vehicle. They didn't have a mid-engine production car at that time. Now, there's some other concepts and prototypes we can go down rabbit holes about. But the point is, their solution was the wheelbase of the Audi is longer than all of these rear-wheel drive cars. What if we shorten it? So if they shorten it, which they shortened it almost 13 inches, it caused the car to become extremely twitchy, and it made it easier for them to rotate. Now, what people with the lens of today's WRC don't understand is we're still running 3 pedals back then, and nobody had Billy Club hydraulic handbrakes that they could just wrap on next to their sequential gearboxes. You weren't yanking the handbrake to get the car to come around. That was an emergency type of thing. So that's why you see the famous videos of Walter Röhrl jumping on the pedals and left foot braking, and left foot braking became a thing because of rally, because they needed to keep the turbo spooled up, but it also helped them to get the car to pitch in and to rotate.
Eric Carlson did that in those 2-stroke Saabs. They had so little power, he would just, like, you never wanted to let them lose. He'd just keep his foot on the throttle and dab at the brake.
Yeah, exactly. So the other thing that they did was when the Sport Quattro came out in 83, they also started to reduce the weight. What people don't realize is the long wheelbase cars were still sheet metal. They were still very much a factory car that you could buy, but with a lot more horsepower. The thing was, the 5-cylinder is an overbuilt engine. It's extremely reliable even to this day. It revs like a 4. It has the torque of a 6. But when you put it with a turbo, suddenly it wakes up. It's alive. It has like tremendous horsepower and it can turn to 10,000 RPM without batting an eye. Audi brought the turbos to WRC, but that was being borrowed from Formula One technology because the turbo era had already come to Formula One. But in a strange way, turbos made more sense in rally. Even though they were laggy, Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche working together, where did the turbo technology come from? From the 911. That had already come out in the late 70s, in 1975, 78 with the 930s, things like that. So it wasn't a foreign concept. So when the Sport Quattro came out, slightly bigger engine, 2.2 liter, all the way up to 2.3 at one point, things like that. And that motor continued to evolve. Suddenly it was made of carbon Kevlar and it had crank fire ignition and it had some other tricky bits that later became the torque sensing differentials and all this stuff that they were working on. And in one of the videos, that we looked at together, dual clutch direct sequential gearboxes, which we all go, well, Volkswagen invented that with the GTI in the 2000s. Well, Audi worked on that 30 years before that point. So a lot of experimentation, a lot of development happening. And every year they kept upping the ante. So as soon as Audi shortened the car and Balestra raised his hands and said, you all do whatever you want, I don't really care because sales are up. He's making money on the back end somehow. And
well, the sport was generating so much money.
Exactly.
At that point, it was when you said he was more, I'd not thought of him as a businessman before. But when you said that, I had a sort of like, duh moment with it, because the reason that everyone was ignoring the obvious accident waiting to happen was that everyone was getting rich off it because, you weren't living in Europe at the time.
Well, we were watching it in the States.
But there was a real buzz. I mean, the BBC sponsored an Audi Quattro in the 1984 Lombard RAC Rally. They actually sponsored a car themselves so that they could have proper camera access and all of that. The Lancias, though, you talked a bit there about the Audis. Talk about the Lancias there, because we talked about how the Stratos is the 70s thing.
Yeah.
The 037, or the Lancia Rally, as it seemed to be known in period. Yes, it was based on what we in Europe called the Monte Carlo and what I think in the States was called the Lancia Scorpion.
Correct.
But it wasn't really, was it? I mean, my understanding is you really didn't want to crash head on in it because there's basically just a spare tire and some suspension bits and your feet and the pedal box, and you're just going to get your legs all mangled up. So in that sense, the thing's like a Formula One car. So that was supercharged, wasn't it? So that was Lancia's experiment with supercharger.
Right.
Was that not more developed than the short wheelbase Quattros, even though it's an earlier car?
Exactly.
But only 2-wheel drive. So awesome on the tarmac events, okay on like the safari and the endurance kind of events, crappy on events like the RAC.
Yeah. So Lancia, or Lancia, depending on how you want to pronounce it, it all goes back to the race director of the motorsports program there. So we have to talk about Cesare Fiorio for just a second. And there's a great way to summarize this for anybody that wants to dive off the deep end. Go watch last year's movie, Race to Glory. And it's about the sort of dogfight between Audi and Lancia. And some of it is a dramatization, but it's a really interesting way to engage with Group B. But again, going back to the Stratos, to your point, the Stratos was the beginning of like the prototype cars. But going even further back, Lancia had its racing heritage buried in rally, going back to the Fulvia and other cars, and they just continued to evolve. When you're the incumbent, sometimes the rules are bent in your favor. But then when you have somebody like Fiorio at the helm who says, if you can't be as strong as your competitors, you must be more clever. And he was known for doing all sorts of shenanigans. But the 037, even though it was reminiscent to the Beta Monte Carlo or the Scorpion, in its shell, the reality of the situation was it was a completely tube frame car. The homologation rules were written that it forced Lancia to build street versions of that car. And there's a really funny scene, and it's based on a true story, where Lancia couldn't build the 200 cars. They played the shell game. And when the inspectors from the FIA came, they had 100 cars in one location. They said, well, there's only 100 here. Where's the rest of them? Well, let's go to lunch. We'll do lunch, blah, blah, blah. And then we'll take you to where the other cars are. Meanwhile, they load up those 100 cars, move them to another facility. And then after lunch, drive those guys over and they go, oh, there's 100 cars over here. Now we have 200. So again, if you can't be stronger, be more clever. whatever. So these are the kinds of shenanigans that Lancia is doing because they want to maintain their reputation as the kings of rally. But when it came to Group B, the 037, unless it was a completely tarmac rally like Corsica, which was predominantly in the dry, and that's where the 037 failed, was in the rain at the RAC Lombard rallies, is it couldn't do the job of the other cars. They carried it as long as they could. And Lancia sort of scrambling, going, what do we do? What do we do? We are now the also rans. They have great drivers. They got Marco Alain, Toivonen, all these folks driving for them. And it's like, we can't make this work. The 037 wasn't a failure. It was just past its prime because the beta Monte Carlo that it was based on was a car from the 70s. It was old technology. So what did they do? They said, you know what? Giugiaro built us a really cool car, the Delta, which was also a 70s car. I want to point that out. By that point, by 1984, 1985, we had moved away from homologation into the Group B evolution period. And now, and I think it was in Lancia's favor that they changed the rules, they developed the Lancia Delta S4, which, to your point, the only thing that reminds you of a Delta is the backside of it, that it's still a hatchback.
And it was all a con, right? I remember I spent Christmas when I was first getting into reading car magazines. I spent a Christmas in Germany, Christmas 1985. And my uncle very kindly had bought me all these car magazines for me to read because he knew I had an interest in cars. And in a couple of these were pictures of the launch of the Delta S4. And the pictures of it, it looks like a normal Delta with like big wheels at the back. It looks nothing like the actual Delta S4 looked like when it rocked up on the street, because what the actual Delta S4 looks like is nothing like what the 5-door hatchback, the Giugiaro pen. No element of
the windshield might have been the same. That was about it,
Yeah. Yeah.
Lancia comes to the table with the S4, but that wasn't until 1985. And what's interesting about that is that's when the horsepower wars really started to ramp up, because the S4 came to the table and Lancia said, we just broke the 500 horsepower mark. And they're like, well, how did you do that? And to your point from earlier, they used the supercharging technology and then partnered with the turbocharger. So they twin charged the engine to reduce turbo lag. And now they had linear power, almost unlimited power compared to everybody else, a huge rev range in a 4-cylinder package in an extremely light car, mid-engine, all-wheel drive. And they're just kicking everybody's butt. But that's at the tail end of Group B. So now you have to remember, it's a quid pro quo situation. So Audi says, well, we got the Sport Quattro. It only makes 350, and we're limited at 135 miles an hour, and the Delta is just 200 more horsepower. So what are we going to do? Here comes the Evo S1. And there's another iteration beyond that when we go beyond Group B. So Audi reacts and takes the Sport Quattro and puts it on steroids. And then Peugeot, though they had already introduced the 205 T16 at that point, and everybody went, whoa. Lancia, I think, copied the 205 T16 because who in their right mind puts a motor in the middle of a 3-door hatchback?
Absolutely. I felt like when the Delta S4 came along, that permission for the Delta S4 had come from the Peugeot 205 T16. And I felt like the T16 had been allowed to have a longer wheelbase and have this engine in the back seat, which no real Peugeot 205 ever had. It was allowed to have that partly because Peugeot Sport and Balestre were based about 50 miles apart in Paris there.
Well, not only that, Jean Todt, who went to lead Peugeot Motorsport, which brought Peugeot back from the brink of extinction. Everybody's French. We all get along. So countrymen alike, we need to support each other, patriotism, all these kinds of things. So you don't think Balestre is going to turn a blind eye to Peugeot developing a car that makes absolutely no sense?
And if it had had the original wheelbase, it would have been too twitchy.
Yes.
I mean, again, listening to these rally reports, the Metro 6R4, Tony Pond on that first RAC rally on the straights, he couldn't keep it straight. It was so twitchy because the wheelbase is so short.
Same thing. What Austin Rover MG Metro on the planet came with a 6-cylinder that made 400 horsepower? Zero.
Before we talk about the Metro 6R4, I want to talk about this Astra 4S. Had you heard of that before?
Yes.
I had not heard of that before doing research for this presentation. And I wonder if Vauxhall were feeling like, as if they had to do something because Austin Rover and everybody else was. But my understanding is that this was a 4-wheel drive Astra, but it used a Zax Speed turbo Formula One engine.
Like the Capri had.
Oh, like the Capri 1700 Zack Speed. Oh, one of my all-time favorite cars, that car. I love a Ford Capri like nothing else. And those Zack Speed ones are just so awesome. Yeah. Wow. So let's talk about the 6R4 then for a little bit.
What an awe-inspiring car, but a disappointment at the same time. Like, I could never get on board with the 6R4. I have more appreciation for it today with the eyes of a veteran WRC fan than I did in period. In period, I was like, what a joke. What a weird car. This is never going to work, especially when you compared it to the Peugeot or to the Lancia and even the Audi, which at that time was sort of falling behind the curve. But the sound of the 6R4 is one of those things that at first you're like, is that the 939? Which most folks don't know is the rally edition of the 911, which then later they developed into the 959 and all those kinds of things. And so, no, it's not a 911. That's an Austin Rover. Like, wait, what?
Yeah.
400 naturally aspirated horsepower in a car that's the size of a Fiat 500 or a Fiat Panda, really. I mean, it's absolutely microscopic compared to the other cars. And to your point, the early 6R4 was short. If you listen to Pond and Wilson, they talk about how they had to make the car longer and slightly wider to make it less twitchy and make it more maneuverable. But again, all of this comes as part of this space race. Everybody's trying to catch up with Peugeot until Lancia came on the scene. And suddenly now the bar was, well, you only have 400 horsepower? We've got 520.
I had the same sense as you, Eric, that I was disappointed in period. And for me, it was like yet another like Austin Rover, wah, wah, right? It was like yet another Red Robbo on strike. It was just like wet cardboard, just like England, like get out of my face.
Right.
Like that's how I felt about it. And so I remember reading the article about the launcher and being like, it's not fucking turbocharged. Why are we even turning up?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Whereas my thought now is if it could put the power down better watching these RAC rallies, it's clear that Pond is expecting Arlen and Toivonen to crash.
Yes.
And they do. It just so happens they get back on the road. By freakness, they get back on the road. Literally. So at the time, I was all about Lancia. But looking back now, I'm like, Austin Rover had a super pragmatic approach. And certainly the events that, the RAC rally that I watched, they were competitive-ish and didn't seem to feel the need to put it off the road or roll it or all of this other tomfoolery that those awesome Finns that I so loved in period did.
And I think when we look back on it now with more education about the mechanics of these cars and things like that, what you can come to respect about a non-turbo 6-cylinder Metro 6R4 making 400 horsepower compared to everybody else is that the torque was immediate. They didn't have to wait. And so when you look at some of those time trials and special stages from, let's say, Lombard and other parts of the RAC and other parts of the WRC, you realize the Metro was quicker out of the corners, even though it didn't have the top end that everybody else had. So yes, the Peugeot could go into a speed trap at 100 miles an hour, and the Audi was right behind it at 90, and the Metro would come trundling along at 88. But the difference was, as Hannu Mikkola would say, the corners came up a lot faster. So you had to brake harder. You had to drop so much more speed. And when you drop that kind of speed in a corner, now you're outside of the optimal torque band and rev range and boost parameters that the motor's looking for, and they're absolute dogs. Versus the Metro was small, it was agile, they could toss it in the corner and just stand on it and wring its neck, but they had 6-cylinder torque, and that was what made that car extremely special.
So I feel like the Peugeot had to do an extended wheelbase. And if you look at later iterations of the T16, the Pikes Peak car that Vatanen uses, that's a 405 that was a four-door sedan, bigger class of car, and it allowed them to do that longer wheelbase to balance it a bit more. And this is exactly the right opportunity then to be like, well, what the F happened to Ford, given they were the dominant force all the way through? And it goes right back to the place that we started with this 2 stages of homologation, because they had a car. I guess they were caught wrong-footed because of the whole like silhouette issue that in 1980 the old Escort was replaced by a new Escort, the Escort Mark III. That was a front-wheel drive hatchback. Well, that was shit for rallying.
It was shit in general. I mean, come on.
No, it wasn't. It was actually a really good car. It was the beginning of Ford.
The ones we got in America were terrible.
Oh, you did get that body style in America, didn't you? I'm sorry. The European ones, they were light on their feet and faster than the first generation Astra was better than that first generation Escort. But the rest of the time through the 80s, the Escorts were okay. But front wheel drive, right? No good for rallying. So Ford developed this thing called the RS 1700T. There were about 3 of them built. And by the time Audi were there with the Quattro, I think Ford thought this thing's just not fast enough for us to be competitive with. So they were like, right, back to the drawing board, and created this thing, the RS 200, that right at the end of Group B. So it launches, and in those early warm-up events is involved in one of the accidents that ends Group B.
I always looked at the RS200 as a day late and a dollar short, to summarize that thought.
No, not a dollar short. I think it would have been, I think it was a day late. I think it could have been developed into a, I mean, fundamentally, who do you trust to organize winning rallies more, Ford or Lancia? I mean, Ford, right?
If I look at the stats, I'd lean on Lancia.
Had the accidents not happened,
yes,
the RS200 would have been destroying. And I say this as a committed Arlen fan. He would not have been competitive because I think the Fords would have been faster. I think the RS200 was right at the bottom of its development curve.
True, but the RS200 took us back 10 years, if you think about it, because the reason I looked at it as a day late and a dollar short, not because Ford didn't spend an exorbitant amount of money developing the RS200. When you really stood back and looked at it, that's a really interesting 037 with all-wheel drive. It's basically the same principle, the same idea. The drivers like Stig and Marco Alain and other people that got behind the wheel of an RS200 were the same guys that drove 037s and cars like that. So did they design that car for them, or did they design it to compete? There wasn't a clear motivation for the RS200 other than Ford wanted to come in and win. And Ford didn't become dominant in WRC until now with M Sport and all those other things with the Puma and the Fiesta and all those cars that we could talk about at a later date. To me, the RS200 was the beginning of something good, but it's a day late and a dollar short because of how Group B ended prematurely. And we'll get into that.
So Ford like miscoordinated, right? The timing was just unfortunate for them. They had one car that was uncompetitive, developed another one that would have been competitive. Classic Ford, I think. But, you know, it just arrived a bit too late.
I think with a couple more seasons, had they been going the way they'd been going, we'd be also not just talking about the RS200. We'd be talking about the battle between Ford and MG.
Yeah. Before this recent research, I'd have not felt like that was the case at all. But with this recent research, I have felt like that because I just feel fundamentally the Austin Rover package was going to be more reliable than this turbocharged, supercharged space frame driven by these crashy fins. That feels like
Lotus. It feels like Lotus. That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
But to talk about Lancia, the story continues. The Delta lives on, a car that as it hit its zenith in the 90s in Group A with the Delta HF Integrale, which is take the S4 motor and detune it and put it at the front of the car with a synchro style all-wheel drive system similar to a Rally Golf and some of the other products that were out there. Then you had a car that won from 87 to 93, and Lancia cemented itself because a new class was born around that car.
But it was tiddlywinks, Eric.
It was
tiddlywinks. And I have respect for Mickey Biazion, who was the winning driver of that period. You've told a nice story about how it was, but no, it wasn't, right? This was the Giugiaro car from the early 70s.
Exactly.
Hatchback with the slab side body, with the transverse inline 4-cylinder engine making a feeble 100 horsepower with a turbo on it. It was a bloody yawn in comparison to the way that it had been. The music was gone.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
But I so loved it in period.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
Loved the Lancias in period. And you can't understate that Martini livery looked good. That
Oh,
martini
always.
livery really looked good.
Oh, they all looked good. I mean, let's be real. I mean, they're iconic even to this day. I mean, if I could paint my cars in my house or myself in, an Audi Sport livery or the Peugeot livery or the Martini, well, Rothman's cars, they're all gorgeous. Never to be done again in some respects. I mean, we pay tribute to those cars. There's all sorts of things like that exist today, but it's just not the same.
Citroën, they too were caught with their pants down. The Visa GTI was meant to be what Group B was meant to be. It was meant to be budget rallying, but then Audi and everyone
Yep.
kind of got ahead of themselves. And so Citroën too were caught on the hop. And then they did that BX
The 4TC.
right at the end. And we were talking about this sort of before we came on air. I was talking with my producer before we came on air.
Yeah, the 4TC was their answer to Group B, but again, another car that showed up in 1985. It took them 2 years to figure out what they were going to build. And then by 85 into 86, Group B was disbanded. Again, a day late and a dollar short, right?
I'll tell you who wasn't a day late or a dollar short. And I was watching my rally and thinking, cool cars. The Toyota Celicas.
The Celica.
Celicas with the 2JZ. These would have been early examples of turbocharging 2JZs. And they're big and long. This is full on Dukes of Hazzard stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And awesome. And the Nissans were the same, but not turbocharged. They were Nissan 240s that were similar and not turbocharged.
Maybe we look on it with a bit of nostalgia, rose-colored glasses. But I tell you what, you made the comment earlier about the virtual world and how it's paid homage to these cars.
That's exactly what I was going to say, right? Because when I'd been knocking around the idea of revisiting Group B for ages, because I noticed how it had come along in the games, and I noticed the way that my gamer mates love the cars. I'm not a gamer myself, but I was sufficiently aware of the gaming community to see how the cars of Group B had continually made themselves relevant.
Group B was the motorsport that I imprinted on as a kid. I'm less than 10 years your junior, let's say. So I had a different way of absorbing the data. You were there at some of those events. I was watching them here through very expensive cable feeds and whatnot, but I'm watching them happen. I'm watching the videos later. My dad would buy them from the UK and we'd watch the replays, and I still have them on the shelves to this day. I wanted to be a rally driver. Formula One was amazing, and I love Senna, and we did that whole tribute episode to him, but I wanted to be Hannu Mikkola. I wanted to ride shotgun with Michèle Mouton. I wanted to meet Walter Röhrl, Stig Blomqvist, all these guys. Like, they were incredible. Now, granted, I'm listing all of the works team's drivers for Audi, but Marco Alain, all the same, right? Today, and ever since then, I started playing The Sims, the original Dirt series by Codemasters, the Network Q Rally series that existed on the PC, and now it's all WRC, this and that, and Electronic Arts has bought them all. What's interesting is the really hardcore Sims, the stuff that's on par with the Assetto Corsas and the iRacings of the world, they've done a very good job of studying those cars, analyzing those cars, testing those cars, doing the 3D renderings, all those. And when I get behind the wheel on a sophisticated sim of a rally car, yes, I'm sort of living through the digital experience, having driven some of these homologation versions, the R5 Turbo 2, owning a UR Quattro, Lancia Delta, some of these other cars. I get behind the digital wheel and it translates to me. I have a feeling of what it was like. And I watch the videos and I'm like, the car reacts the way it does in the file footage. They've done a very good job of that. And so my only analysis of the actual Group B cars and their performance is through the digital world. What is interesting is they're so vastly different. Handling characteristics, acceleration. The Audi is like a missile when it comes to off the line and at high speed because it can turn 10,000 RPM. It's just unbelievably good at the top end. But you get it into a corner and you're like, oh, God, it's just plowing a field. And it doesn't matter if it's the Evolution versions either, but the Peugeot is quick and it's nimble. But then suddenly, because it's not designed to be a mid-engine car, its polar moment is completely wrong. And when you think it's going to lift throttle oversteer, it just completely snaps and it's all over the place. And then you can't control it and it's tank slapping and it's a mess. And when you watch the videos, it does the exact same thing. You're like, why did he spin there? Because the cars are twitchy. The Metro 6R4 the same. The Delta S4, they did a lot of learning and studying the mistakes of everybody else. It's very smooth, but it has this, if you scruff it a little too hard, it's going to bite you back, those kinds of things. I recommend people, if you want to get a firsthand experience, go try the latest version of WRC, which is WRC 11 by Electronic Arts, where they bought Codemasters and they're one big happy family now. You get a sense of these cars. It's unlike anything else. I prefer the Group A cars. They're easier to drive. They're a lot more fun. Your stage times are actually quicker with half the horsepower.
Well, that's why I wonder if that Metro mightn't have been a bit of world beater had there been scope to do it. So I'll put you on the spot now, Eric. Which was the best car of the era? I don't mind going first whilst you're thinking. I think probably, based upon what we've said here, Delta S4.
A lot of people would agree with you that it is the halo car of the Group B period. As legendary as the Audi S1 is, as legendary as the 205 T16 is, as quirky as the Renault 5 Turbo 2 is, and some of the other cars that are in the field, my heart always sort of leans Audi. I bleed Audi. But if I have to pick one, the best, the Lancia is on paper the best, but I think the Peugeot, as proven with the right drivers, and this is where we get into the conversation of, is it the car or is it the driver? I think the Peugeot is something to respect, but I also think it was probably the best car. It was the most well thought out. It was constantly refined, but in an iterative way, not in a gigantic way like the Audi was or like the Delta S4, just outlandish coming on the scene and being ostentatious. The Peugeot was just there, and their changes, like I said, were subtle. Think about when they added the aerodynamics package to the 205 T16. Is that all you guys are doing? You're putting a spoiler and an airfoil on the front? Like, really? That's all you're going to do? Because if you listen to the drivers, all we needed was a little bit more control over the jumps to keep the rear end down so we could continue to maintain traction, things like that. So it doesn't seem very French because they do very big and outlandish things with their cars. But the Peugeot, I think, was the best. If it had gotten more time, it would have continued to evolve. They would have found a way to beat Lancia.
And Vatanen would have come back, wouldn't he? Because
yes.
People may or may not be aware, but sort of midway through 85 Argentina, Vatanen had a horrible accident where the car did that jumping business, didn't land properly, and he end-over-ended and the seat fell off inside the car. So he got all knocked around in the car and really
flattened his knees, broke his back. He was in traction basically for a year and a half or something, I believe he said in an interview.
So we've talked about the cars there. Let's pivot now and talk about the drivers. See if we can do a little thumbnail on each. I've sort of stack ranked the ones that we mentioned in the title of our presentation here. And it begins and ends where if you look at any footage of Ari Vatanen driving a Ford Escort, you've got the car being driven completely out of control, completely wildly. And then when he's interviewed afterwards, his English is perfect. His demeanor is completely calm. The theater of that made it an awesome TV spectacle. So the spectacle was almost there before the cars came along and made it a thing. But what I realized that I'm predisposed to feel very positively towards Hannu Mikkola because he had an amazing run at the RAC rally. You talk about being imprinted, as rallying and motorsport was imprinted on me. The superiority of Hannu Mikkola, and first the Escort and then the Quattro, that was really impressed upon me. In our notes here, I put the comeback king, and when you watch the videos of events now, that's what's really striking about him, is that he can have issues, but he will still be there at the finish, and he seems to have incredible stamina. He seems to get better the longer the event goes on.
Yeah, Hannu Mikkola is a legend. He's one of those people that big fish stories are written about. It's so unbelievable, the stuff that happened to him, but it's also true. And he also kind of epitomizes what I call the full send sort of mentality. I mean, there's one of the videos that you and I reviewed where they broke the front suspension, and I won't talk about the stupidity of, of the steering box design on those cars. It all makes sense when you put it in the context of rally. But he's like, you know what? To your point, I'm bringing the car home with my shielder on it, very Greek in that sense. So he decides, well, we can't go forwards, so I'll drive it backwards for the next 8 miles to the service stop. And you're like, what? There's another one where he lost a front wheel and he tells his co-pilot to get out on the back of the car to counterbalance the fact that he doesn't have a front wheel. And he continues to go just full out with only 3 wheels. And just the nuttiest stuff happened to him.
Yeah.
But he would get out of the car and they're like, Hannu, what's going on? And he's got this cat ate the canary grin on his face. He was always so happy. He's just one of these people that would light up an interview. And you're like, how could you find fault with Hannu Mikkola? Not only that, he was sort of the elder statesman. When you compare him to Alain, who was in his 30s, Toivonen, who was in his late 20s, Walter Röhrl was sort of there, but Hannu Mikkola was in his 40s. And I don't want to say he was an original Flying Finn, but he's of that generation of rally drivers growing up in Scandinavia where to go to school every day, it was like driving a rally for him. So he was the guy, he was the man, if you will. And so I realized that as a kid, I'm like, this is somebody to aspire to be. Hannu Mikkola, unbelievable.
He's from that part of Finland right up in the north
Yeah.
that fought the Russians in the war.
Yeah.
And there's definitely a difference between these sort of blonde Finns in the north and the guys like Toivonen and Arlen, who have dark hair and dark eyes and are from around Helsinki. And I need to do more research, but wasn't Arlen's dad like an ice racing champion?
Yeah.
So you feel like their skills are more the way that Kenny Roberts grew up racing dirt track, and therefore he could slide a 2-stroke sports race bike in exactly the same way. You felt like there was that translation for Arlen and Toivonen. There doesn't seem to be any of that for these guys like Vatanen and Mikkola who live in the far north.
What's also interesting about Hannu is he was the first to come over to the Works team, and then they brought over other popular drivers. You look at Stig Blomqvist, you look at Walter Röhrl, Michèle Mouton. They were already successful with other cars, rear-wheel drive cars, and so was Hannu Mikkola. But the thing was, when you looked at the progression, Audi didn't favor him as their prized calf. If you look, while everybody else was running the Sport Quattro, he was still driving the long wheelbase car. And when the S1 came out, then he got the Sport Quattro. And it's like he was always a generation behind, even though all of these things happened in very rapid succession. It was like your most experienced guy doesn't have your best car.
No, because I think they gave him the car to finish.
Yeah.
I think Mouton was go out and win or crash. And I hadn't realized, to be honest, that she was just how much
super aggressive
she was like that until I did some research for this. I think Röhrl, the RAC rally that I watched where he was using that DSG gearbox, in the interview, he talks about how the team just wanted to get as far as possible. And there was no way he was going to, that whole no pace notes thing on the RAC rally, really, that benefits the local runners, right?
Yeah.
Anybody, any British rally guys, they're going to have used these stages for local rallies. So it was a way of tipping the tables a little bit in our favor. And somebody like Röhrl, who only came for the international event, inevitably he's at a bit of a disadvantage. So I can understand, why would you want to commit to an event like that where you're at a disadvantage? I rate Walter Röhrl more and more as the years go by, partly because of stuff I've seen him do with Porsche in the years since World Rally. He was World Rally champion in 1980. He was champion in 82. Even when the Audi was borderline a developed car. And he did that by not trying to beat it on sheer speed, but just by doing the best that he could with his Ascona 400 and letting the reliability of the Audi be its own undoing. Apart from Mouton, he and Mouton are the only, I would describe those two as the only non-Scandinavian front rank drivers.
At that time, yes, there were a handful of Italians and a couple of other Frenchmen in there and things like that.
Not front
runners, because what you don't realize about WRC at that time is there was a clear delineation between the 4-wheel drive cars, the 2-wheel drive Group Bs, and then everybody else. And today, we call that WRC1, WRC2, and WRC Junior. And so back then, they sort of didn't do that. It was like, here's everybody. Yes, your front runners are going to be the Works team's drivers that we're talking about. But when you specifically talk about Walter Röhrl, you have to remember that his legacy starts in rally, but continues with Audi for many years after that, because he came to the States and then partnered with Hans Stuck and Hurley Haywood and ran in Trans Am and then in IMSA. Audi used Walter to teach Hans, who was already a well-established driver, and Hurley, this is how you drive an Audi. This is how you drive a turbo all-wheel drive car. We need to use rally techniques in road racing to get these cars to be competitive. We have, quote unquote, an unfair advantage here because of Quattro, and we won't get into that. But Walter always compared himself to Ari Vatanen. They were rivals without being rivals, because for whatever reason, you would think rally would be one of these disciplines of motorsport where it's like coming after a football match and, bloody noses and smelling of beer and sweat and things like that. But it was actually very civilized, polite in some ways.
Well, because what you're doing is so dangerous.
Exactly.
That, I read Kankkunen, the next car through the stage, comes upon Arlen in trouble, stops, helps Arlen get back on the road, helps push the Lancia back on the road, doesn't just drive by. And that's a legacy of that business of when the events were less about speed and more about endurance. Yeah, there is a camaraderie, isn't there, about rally, and that you get a sense that they're all friends with each other. And certainly there's a theatre about the interview which take place where
Correct.
It seems like the interviewer always says, do you know what position you're in? And the driver who's competing in the rally says, no, I've no idea what position I'm in. And you can see that there's a banter about that, which is all sort of summed up by that phrase that we all know so well associated with rallying. How will you be driving, Marku? Oh, maximum attack.
My other favorite phrase of his was, my mechanic is fantastic. Like, come on.
I wasn't going to talk about him first, but we've started talking about him. There's one interview where he's got those Frankenstein dour brows and he's like leaning over the interview and it's a dark rally stage and they're talking about the Delta S4. And then they mention to him about the Stratos and how much he must have enjoyed. And his face lights up. He's like a child.
Yes.
Like he's like a child who's been given a gift, like his face lights up. And oh man, I was struck. In that moment, I realized that, again, you talk about the imprinted. That was the moment. It was those interviews that made me such a Marco Arlen fan. But what about Michèle Mouton? Because I have to say, you bigged her up before we did this. And I thought, you know what? She was a great piece of marketing fluff. And, she could drive a bit, but she was great marketing fluff. Oh, on the contrary, she could drive a lot and the marketing fluff was good too.
100%.
So what was her background? Because I know very little about her.
She's very private. It's really hard to get her backstory. What I've been able to collect over the years, she's still on my, Mount Everest of people that I would love to interview on Break Fix, is that she came from money, Southern France, everything that goes along with that. And so how she got into racing is still a little bit foggy, but she got in because she's French. And she got in with a French team, and then they realized she was really fast and she could do all these things, and then moved around like all the rally drivers did. If you follow them, you're like, man, Stig Blomqvist drove a Talbot? Really? Like, I always thought he just drove for Audi. And, Walter Röhrl drove an Opel. They all had to start somewhere. So her beginnings are a little foggy. How she came to Audi, I have never been able to figure out, other than the fact that if you look at what Audi did, they sort of cherry picked the best drivers at the time. Stig Blomqvist, Walter Röhrl, Hannu Mikkola, Michèle Mouton, and they said, let's do this. They talk about it a little bit in that movie Race to Glory. They introduce her as the new kid compared to Hannu, compared to Walter, but they don't go much more into that. What makes her more important in some ways than just the marketing fluff and her speed, because she's still fast to this day when she gets behind the wheel of a rally car, is that there were a surprising number of women in rally. Even one of the commentators from Top Gear, Sue Baker, was a former rally co-driver. We saw that in some of those interviews. Her and Fabrizia Pons, an all-woman team, on an underdog. Audi had never done rally before. They were the new kid on the block. Everything was new. All-wheel drive was new. All of it was new. And here we have a woman and a female co-driver, and they're out running with the bulls, kicking butt and taking names. Now, is she as winning as the others? Yes and no. On paper, maybe not. Hannu Mikkola had 20 rally wins under his belt by the time he had gotten to Audi. Again, he was the elder statesman, right? He had already seen it, been there, done that, gotten the t-shirt. But Michèle, she's someone to aspire to. in the face of everything, in the face of the early 80s and all the tropes and the stereotypes and the discrimination and everything that goes along with motorsport at that time, she persevered. But what's interesting is Rally supported her. It didn't hold her back. They didn't say, well, you're just a third rate. We need a fourth driver and you're going to drive the slowest car. Those kinds of things. They let her shine. They let her excel.
Isn't there something of the sort of the Margaret Thatcher thing that they always said that, in a cabinet meeting, that Margaret Thatcher just outmenned all the men in the room?
In some ways, you could say that.
And in that sense, there's almost an argument that she sort of knocked back equality because she was just so fucking awesome.
Yeah.
You can almost argue Barack Obama was another, his sheer ability as an individual overcame whatever prejudice there might have been knocking around. Her speed overcame. I've had that revelation now that I really thought it was clever marketing for Audi, because Audi always did have clever marketing. And oh, sure as shit it was that, but she was really fast. And that decision in one of those RAC rallies to give her the short wheelbase car with more power, like absolutely, give her the fast car and give Mikkola the car that's more likely to get home. Like that's exactly what I would have done if I was the team manager. What a awesome pairing. There is film I've seen, this was some years ago, of her and Mikkola communicating with each other, basically, where it's a safari rally and Mikkola has stopped to help her. And the teamwork there with Mikkola making the effort to help her, with it being about Audi finishing, that I remember feeling was really cool.
Audi viewed it more as an endurance than a race. They were proving their technology in a big way. They needed those cars to finish, because think about it. If the Quattros failed consistently, and they broke, they didn't fail, but they broke. But if they had failed miserably, where would we be with Audi today? Think about that for a second.
Yeah. Well, my granddad had an Audi coupe in 1970. There were hundreds of Audis in Britain, only hundreds, it was that. By 1980, and when the Quattro came along, the brand was established. They did that very famous Vorsprung Dirk Technik advertising campaign, which was based around the Quattro.
Not to wax poetic about Michèle Mouton, but one thing I want to point out about her, when you watch her drive, she's not as ham-fisted like Hannu Mikkola is, where he's willing to take the risk. He brings the car home, but he's going to bring it home again, come hell or high water. But she's not as precise as Walter Röhrl. Walter is very exact. He's very consistent. It's just his very German way of being and of driving. So we got a flamboyant Flynn and we got a very stoic German. And then we have this French woman who sort of blends the two together. Watching her drive was like watching someone ballroom dance. She had this relationship with the Quattro, especially with the Sport Quattro. Once they got her away from the long wheelbase car, that's where she began to blossom. She could get it to rotate. It's like watching a Formula Drift person today, where it's just like, it's like no sweat to have the car completely out of control. And she is composed and as cool as a cucumber. So that's the magic of Michèle Mouton, is when you understand that she's the middle ground. And then sadly, you have Stig Blomqvist, who's the quiet guy in the background, but is an absolute unbelievable driver behind the wheel. And he gets out and he's just very mild-mannered Clark Kent type. And you're just like, oh, okay. But again, behind the wheel, you're Superman.
We should draw a distinction between the true Scandinavians, the Swedes and the Norwegians. Yeah. We're not mentioning any Norwegians. The Swedes like Blomqvist. And of course, Stig Blomqvist is the reason why Top Gear had the Stig. That's where the name came from.
So the Audi Works team, superstars in some respects. Here's the thing. I want to go back to Röhrl for just a second, because it brings us to Peugeot. As you and I have been studying this and talking about this, I began to reanalyze it with a whole new lens. Something started to emerge from this. Listening to interviews where Walter would say something about Ari Vatanen, and he's like, well, don't tell Ari I said that. And Ari would be like, well, don't tell Walter I said that. And they would critique each other. Again, very stoic, very German, Walter Röhrl. This is how we do things. This is the moment that we turn. This is the time at which we break, and all these kinds of things. And Ari Vatanen talks about playing music with his eyes closed and how driving a rally car was like playing the piano and this and that. And I began to realize there was two other drivers, very notable rivalry that you and I have talked about quite a bit, that parallel the two of them. And that is the professor himself, Alain Prost, is like Walter Röhrl, and Ari Vatanen is like Ayrton Senna.
I mean, Vatanen's appeal to me is similar to the appeal that Senna had. Exactly. I mean, the two of them both leapt off the screen for me. Vatanen, the level of commitment that Vatanen shows is just, God is protecting him, let's be clear.
Yeah.
There's also, especially with the escorts, and you talk about the artistry of the drift, the length of the slide, the elegance of the slide, that is just what Ari Vatanen did, just feel like nobody else.
I didn't come to respect Vatanen until he broke Audi's record at Pikes Peak. If you go back and watch the film, and you can search for this on YouTube, it's called Climb Dance. It's set to music with the sound of the 205 engine in that 405 the whole way up Pikes Peak. Then you see the magic of Ari Vatanen because he's by himself, as are the rules of the Pikes Peak hill climb. In the old days of Pikes Peak, not today where it's asphalt all the way to the summit. This is back when it was loose gravel and dirt and changing weather conditions, 13 miles of hell to get to the top of Pikes Peak.
I'm not going to spoil it if Ollie and I, my son, will talk about the Ari Vatanen sun visor, because there's one moment where he comes around the corner and the sun's right in his eyes and he's holding the car in a slide right on the edge of the mountain and he puts his arm up to block the sun.
Yep.
And I always think of that. You know, I have a class of students every year, and they quite often come up with, as students are wont to do, they're quite into solving problems that don't really exist. And a couple of students have talked about how the sun in the eyes is really dangerous, and what you need is one of these windshields that will like shade light. And I'm like, you know, I've got something that's really going to work well for you. It's the Vatanen sun visor.
And again, that whole trip to the summit is incredible. And if you've never seen it, you have to watch it. But what you do need to realize, though, is even though Ari Vatanen broke the record at Pikes Peak at that time, in period, it wasn't by that much. If you go back and look at the timesheets, it's enough. But it's not like, oh, we destroyed it by 10 seconds, like what the Peugeot 205 T16 was doing when it first came on the scene, way ahead of everybody. So it's a glorious run. It's sort of like the lap of the gods at Monaco when you're watching Senna. He's just in the zone. He's doing his thing, although I don't think Senna ever put his hands up to the sun. But the point is, I began to draw a parallel between Prost and Senna and Walter Röhrl and Ari Vatanen. I think it works. I think it's valid.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like rallying so much more random than Formula One. I mean, I feel like Röhrl, well, I don't know, Prost was too, weren't you? You produced a calculated approach. You didn't just throw caution to the wind in the way that people like Senna and Vatanen did. There was a definite sense that they threw caution to the wind. And if you were an event competing with them, if you were going to win, you needed to be able to have that same kind of brain out commitment. Because the British stuff, they always talk about how only Roger Clark could like compete with the Scandinavians. And it's, yeah, only Roger Clark had the courage to slide the car that much. All the others, British guys, prior to that time, they just didn't have the commitment level. So we talked about Vatanen there. Final thing I would say about him is, like Michele, he's from the north, from that. So there's that kind of sort of stoicism about him. The other thing I'd say about him is, and you and I have talked about this before, Eric, there's a wonderful biography that's about him. And it's, I mean, he had this terrible accident and then he convinced himself he had AIDS and couldn't rid himself of the idea that he had AIDS. It was a full on, like, and as bonkers as he was behind the wheel, this was as bonkers as a hole that he fell down and somehow managed to drag himself out of. It's really an incredible kind of a story. And then he goes on and does like Pike Peak and Paris Dakar and is like no slower than he was before. And then he goes on to be a member of the European Parliament, because obviously that's, you know, that's
what you do. I mean, you know,
that's what you do. Yeah. So we'll move to my favorite. Now, you described Lancia as the sort of grandee team of rallying. You know, I think they were, right? Because they had this continual presence, and you would expect them, therefore, to pick the best driver. And this is why I feel like, although I love Vatanen, he's like Mouton. I mean, the guy just couldn't finish.
No.
He finished more than Mouton. He couldn't finish enough. And your comparison with Röhrl is, I mean, Röhrl was a finisher. With him, it was done in a very, very studied. I'd have no fear sitting next to him, driving fast. Sitting next to Vatanen, fucking hell, you were taking your life in your hands, right? Because
extra insurance policy.
I mean, the bloke, he drove it like it was like a computer game, right? Where it doesn't matter if you crash. Literally, that's how he was. Now, I feel like Arlen was like that as well. And Arlen was at Lancia for 20 years.
Yeah.
When you see interviews of him, his Italian's like mine. The Finns would call him like the Italian Finn because he like lost his temper and was all like gesturing and was passionate. You know, it was like the Finns were like, he's not one of ours anymore. He's gone native.
Sort of like Schumacher in that way, right? So many years of Ferrari.
No, because Schumacher never humanized Alain. He was dour, and then there was the moment of humanity.
So comical.
In the interviews, whenever they ask him what's happening, he always beats up his own performance. They like, oh, you crashed off down a fire road. And he's not like, oh, I'm lucky to still be in the rally. He's like, oh, 2-minute penalty. That penalized us 2 minutes and 12 seconds kind of thing. It's like all of this. I have an auto sport that I wish I'd found the quote before we did this, but where the journalist interviews him, and throughout the interview, it's San Remo or something like that. And it's like and throughout the interview, he just keeps muttering too fast, or he's just set fastest stage times, but he just keeps muttering too fast, too fast. On one of the RAC rallies, he spins the S4 flat in fifth and then is able to recover. And in the next 2 stages, sets fastest stage time. I mean, the bloke just had, I wouldn't say no fear, because I feel like that's Vatanen. I feel like he just erred the right side of the Vatanen. But he would be my number one. Like Lancia, I would have picked him. And I might have picked Mikkola as a backup if I was gonna pick a dream team.
And then if you talk about like Toivonen, his teammate in the other car, who had also been rallying forever. And unfortunately, Toivonen died in a horrific accident.
Well, and let's be clear, if people aren't aware, it's the accident that ends Group B. There were other accidents, and we don't want to dwell on that. But really, it's Toivonen's accident which ends Group B. And something that I hadn't learned until I was reading about that was that, without getting into details, it was the design of the car.
Yes.
The fact that the car was fundamentally a Formula One car, not like a Ascona 400, a converted road car. No, it was a Formula One kind of construction, which then meant that it was particularly delicate and vulnerable when the worst happened.
To be explicit about it, it was a bomb. They were sitting on top of the gas tank, much like a Series 1 Land Rover, where you sit on top of the gas tank. So those cars were made out of tube frame and carbon Kevlar. They were super light. They had none of the crash impact and safety things, because again, this was the middle 80s and developed on top of 1970s ideas. So the protection wasn't there. And the rules of the FIA didn't dictate like they do now, where the gas tank must be protected in this way and so many inches from the driver and blah, 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 and all these systems that exist. There was no fire prevention. There was maybe a fire extinguisher if they were lucky. That crash was absolutely horrific. And there's others that go right along with it. But the thing about Toivonen, though, is when you listen to his interviews, with his big gradiated aviator glasses that he always wore, like a lot of other Scandinavians of the style of that time, those big ski glasses that they would wear. But the thing is, he reminds me so much of like an Oitanic. If you follow today's WRC, he's one of those types. Like there's a certain aura in the new drivers that remind me of Toivonen. If you ask me, paint me a picture of a rally driver, it's Toivonen. That's the guy that you go to as sort of the stereotypical rally driver, especially from Scandinavia. And he was entertaining. His English wasn't so great. He always made for a good interview. Like Hannu Mikkola, he was always kind of happy. And that's also part of the tragedy, because he's another one of these cast of characters of Group B that today we have, as you say, there's this bit of theater. It's almost artificial drama, if you think about it, like is painted even in Formula One. They want to make racing more exciting. Back then, there was the camaraderie, and you could tell that they were partying the night before and things were happening. And it was just the spirit of rally and of motorsport at that time was very different than it is today. And I think he epitomized all of it in one person. Toivonen was that example of what it was to be Group B rally. He was another one like Pond, who was the MG driver. These guys were relentless. They had this tenacity, and it was stupid and it was foolish to get behind the wheel of a car knowing that you're suffering from influenza. Today, your doctor would not clear you to get on track or to get on a rally knowing that you're sick. They'd be like, look, we're going to call another driver. You're going to lose your driver points, whatever it is. There's a lot more precaution taken today than there was back then. Lancia's putting pressure. They've got 2 cars, especially at Corsica and a lot of the other tracks. We need to get this done. I don't care if you're sick. Get out there, race. But they had that drive. They had that foolish determination.
I feel like Toivonen's head was just farther above the parapet than anybody else's. The car was faster and more fragile than the others, and he was a Vatanen of a driver.
Yes.
Rather than an Arlen of a driver. He fell on the wrong side of the too fast.
And I think Alain was lucky. That's the word I'd use to describe. It was always, he was on the edge, but to your point, I think he drove at 11 tenths, whereas Vatanen and Toivonen drove at 13 tenths. They were well over their skis when something went wrong.
Yeah, I think so as well. Of course, Arlen and Toivonen both from the Helsinki area. You know, as I say, I feel like there's further investigation around whether or not it was the ice racing stuff, how they got involved in longer stage rallying in the first place. Because I feel like for Vatanen and for Michele growing up in the north, it would have been natural for them to be on those dirt roads all the time. Less so for people living in Helsinki.
So I want to come back to your lead-in question to this whole discussion, to your presentation, to what you're doing at the symposium. You laid it out. Who was the best? Was it the Audi Works team? Was it Lancia? Was it Peugeot? And when you say the best, not necessarily the manufacturer, but we're talking about the driver specifically. And we've been talking about them now for a little bit.
My research, rather than making it easier for me to answer the questions about the driver, it's actually made it harder because the opportunity to show greatness was so based on the car.
Yeah.
You know, like Vatanen was only great when he had the Peugeot. Arlen was only actually competing on the rallies when the Delta S4 was there. So it's because let's be clear, right? Audi won in 82, 83. Audi won some events, but Röhrl won in 82 with an Ascona 400, which then evolves into the Manta later on. In 83, Blonkers is champion for Audi. 84 is the year that the Peugeot comes and is dominant. And then 85, you have the Lancia come in and that being dominant, don't you? And yes, absolutely. Maybe we should have talked about the Audi, then the Peugeot, then the Lancia, because really that's
the progression. Yeah.
That is the progression.
My response to that, my only pushback to the question is, if you look at how rally was organized before Group B and even after Group B, where the drivers would switch teams, if Group B had lasted longer on the global stage and we had shuffled the deck, let's just say Vatanen got behind the wheel of the Audi and Marco Alain broke his relationship with Lancia and maybe went to Peugeot, and Walter Röhrl went to, Lancia. We shuffled it around. It goes back to, is it the car or is it the driver? So can we really quantify who was the best? And if we're going to say who is the best, what criteria do we use? I think this actually goes a lot back to our conversation we had about the greatness of Senna. Where does he stack rank against a Lewis Hamilton or a Michael Schumacher or a Fangio? So if you look at it just between 1981 and 1986, how do we quantify who's the best?
I picked a question that was going to provoke us talking. I didn't necessarily pick a question that I thought was something that we could answer in a meaningful way. I suppose I hedged my bets already, didn't I? I picked somebody who errs, if there's a line with crashing on this side and being too slow on the other side. I picked Arlen, who I feel sits on the crashing too much side, but just by a little bit. And I'd pick Michele, who I feel sits on the slow side of the line, but just by a little bit. For me, the other people we've had, they fall too far on one side or the other side.
You don't think Michele is most iconic of the bunch based on all the other facts involved?
No, maybe that's because for me, it is that childhood imprint, right? And am I thinking specifically about that period, 81, 82 to 86? Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm thinking about the earlier period as well. And maybe that's why Michele and Vatanen sort of loom large for me. I do feel like, you can measure it in different ways, can't you? You can look at the statistics and say who won the most events, and you can see who won the most points. And you can also use the esoteric measures and say, you could just see by the way that Vatanen drives, there's an artistry there, which is a kind of greatness. that work that I did around Senna and the strange way that he's moved to being considered the greatest of all time in Formula One, whether or not he really is, that sort of weird beatification thing that I've talked about with Senna. The hard thought coming out of that work is that maybe greatness is about the way in which you do things rather than what you do. So it's not about whether you win 50 million championships. It's about whether you do it with style and class and panache. And then it's about what appeals, right? So definitely Vatanen appeals to me for that. You know, in this presentation that we've done tonight, I feel like my passion for Arlen's method of communication and the fact that he is in just the right place for me, right? As I say, he's the first guy that I would want to sign. Absolutely no question. And I'd go for Vatanen afterwards as well, because my thought would be, I've got two cars, so one of them will probably finish.
Yeah. I think if we played the pit stop question game where it's like, well, who do you want to have a beer with? It's sort of like Alain, Hannu Mikkola, and Vatanen. Those are the guys you want to sit down at a pub and have a pint and talk war stories about rally because they're entertaining, they're personable.
Tony Pond.
Oh, Pond is, too.
Love to have a beer with Tony Pond because he's so understated. It would have to be a pub in the Midlands, like a pub in the Midlands in England, right? It would have to be, I would just want to meet him.
Yeah.
You know, because he died very young.
He did.
That? 56 in 2002, pancreatic cancer. My God.
So the problem is, in period, you can only go based on the timesheets and the results and the rally stage wins and the points and all that kind of stuff to say who is the best. Was it Walter? Was it Hannu? Was it Marco, etc.? But 40 years later, when you look at it under new eyes, this is the conclusion that I came to when you talk about who was the best. And it was very simple. If we just stay within the confines and the parameters of Lancia, Peugeot, and Audi, Lancia doesn't exist anymore. Stellantis has no plans. They've teased, the Ypsilon might be coming. There's some tribute cars out there like Singer style, Delta HFs and 037s and Stratoses and things like that have been developed. But the factory, Lancia doesn't really exist. So they're gone. Peugeot Sport,
No, it's gone. I read that they closed it a couple of years ago. The original place on the road out of Paris, south of Paris there.
They're sort of still around only in LMP1 GTP now in WEC, the World Endurance Championship, with the Peugeot 9X8. You could say Peugeot Sport is still around. They're branded as Peugeot Sport, but it's different. It's not the Peugeot Sport of Jean Todt of the 80s and all that kind of stuff. One could say Lancia doesn't exist as a brand. Peugeot's still around making cars. They make some really interesting stuff. I'd love to drive some of the new 208s and some of those cars that I've seen even last year when I was in Europe. But on the racing scene, not so much. They did a couple of things in the past with Le Mans. They've done Formula One. If you think about Jordan Prost, a little Peugeot based. So that's great. And then Audi. Audi has come well beyond anybody's expectations. If you think about Audi in 1980, when it approaches rally with a new car and a new technology and a team of all-stars, but really an underdog, an unknown, Roland Gumpert, who's this guy, the head of Audi development, what? Who? Audi what? You think about it, Audi proved what they needed to prove, and this is a very German thing, right? We've done what we needed to do. Now we move on. They go to Trans Am and they kick butt and they get banned. Then they go to DTM and they kick butt and they get banned. They go to IMSA and they kick butt and they get banned. Then they end up in ALMS forever. They end up winning at Le Mans. And now next year, they're going to be in Formula One. So if you think about it from that perspective, who's the best? It's still Audi. And people like Walter Röhrl and Michèle Mouton, who are still with us, are still associated with the brand. That to me, and I'm trying to put my bias aside, but they've proven themselves to be the best. And I think they will continue in any discipline that they apply themselves, but they have to realize that their roots came from WRC.
That's an interesting perspective, Eric. Not sure if I agree. I still feel like you have to look at it from the perspective of the period itself. And in that period, you have to pick the Lancia. It's the most technologically advanced.
Just to bring this full circle for those that are maybe now Googling Group B, learning more about it. Maybe you knew something about it before. Maybe you've learned something from this. I want to let people know that Group B did continue after it was disbanded. So there's a couple things that we have to myth bust here at the tail end of this. So Toivonen's death was the turning point. That's when Balestra said, it's time to pump the brakes. The space race is over. We're not doing this unlimited horsepower thing anymore. We're not letting you do evolution cars, all this kind of stuff. He did a complete 180 on Group B and he shut it down. What people don't realize is Audi had already pulled out basically the tail end of the season before because of a death that had occurred at Portugal. And they were like, this is getting crazy. Crowd control is an issue, which begs the question, if we had better crowd control, would the rally stage times have been faster? Because the drivers had to really compensate for people in the middle of the road and the journalists and all this kind of thing. There were other deaths before that point. You know, they call the Group B years also the killer years in motorsport. And so Toivonen's death is that moment at which Group B died. But it got 2 extra years everywhere else around the world because of special events like Paris-Dakar, Pikes Peak Hill Climb, where Group B cars were still used in official events, but they weren't sanctioned WRC Group B class events, those kinds of things. Group B, like I said before, was disbanded and replaced by Group A, and that's where the Delta HF Integrale comes on the scene. This is where you start to see Mitsubishi coming to play.
And of course, the Subis. That's the...
Exactly. Subaru is making a bigger splash.
The Celica GT4.
That's right.
That's the other car that the young'uns like now, real rally pedigree.
And that's a whole new generation of rally fans coming into the 90s, into the early 2000s, the lower horsepower cars. To this day, even the current WRC cars with their hybrid systems, all their tricky bits and all the stuff that they have going on are not as powerful and has been proven they're not as fast as the Group B cars. The Group B cars are the monsters of rally, and they always will be, never to be repeated again. I think it's like in the rule book at FIA that nothing like it will ever happen again, you know, because of everything that went down and Toivonen's death and all that.
Yeah.
So for those of you listening to this and listening to us pontificate about Group B for so long now, it's one of those things that if you're not familiar with it, you will suddenly become addicted to it and then follow rally. It's really interesting. And I try to remind people all the time, you don't have to buy WRC Plus, although it's awesome to go back, just like Formula One subscription service. You can go back and watch all the old footage and all the old rallies, which is really cool because rally, there's a lot of it captured in the 80s. They had amazing footage considering how long a rally stage is and how complicated they are and things like that. But today you can watch Red Bull's coverage of WRC on the Red Bull app for free. And I highly recommend people do that. You can jump into the cars. You can watch Terry Neuville live, Oitanek, Esa-Pekka Lappi, all the current drivers. And the hilarity of rally hasn't changed. The danger, it's the riskiest, if not the riskiest, one of the riskiest motorsports out there. But their car control is second to none. Now, granted, they're 2-pedal cars, they're ruddering, hybrids and hydraulic this and flappy paddle that and all that. And it doesn't have the same appeal, let's say, as Group B does. But go back and check out Group B footage. It's all over YouTube. Group A footage, for that matter. It'll get you excited. And I wish there was a Drive to Survive sort of thing for rally, because I think more people would be interested in it. And you get to see some of the most unique biomes in the planet by watching rally. You don't get that. Yeah, Formula One, you're like, oh, yeah, they go to Singapore and they go to Austin and they go to Australia, but it's on a paved circuit.
Yeah.
In rally, you never know what's going to happen. The weather is constantly changing. Sometimes it's at night, sometimes it's at day, sometimes torrential downpour. You never know what you're going to get.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that insight into modern rally there, Eric. That's really useful for me. We've come to the end of the agenda here now, so I feel like I have more than enough material, not just create a pod here, but also to create something for the IMRRC.
I always jump at the opportunity to do a crossover episode with you, John.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Good stuff. Well, anyway, I look forward to seeing what you come up with for the symposium. So I want to know how you're going to boil all this down.
Yeah, well, I want to know how I'm going to do it as well. And yeah, I'm going to really get on the case and do this sooner rather than later, because I'm just not going to have time otherwise.
This episode has been brought to you by Grand Touring Motorsports as part of our Motoring Podcast Network. For more episodes like this, tune in each week for more exciting and educational content from organizations like the Exotic Car Marketplace, the Motoring Historian, Break Fix, and many others. If you'd like to support Grand Touring Motorsports and the Motoring Podcast Network, sign up for one of our many sponsorship tiers at www.patreon.com/GT Motorsports. Please note that the content, opinions, and materials presented and expressed in this episode are those of its creator, and this episode has been published with their consent. If you have any inquiries about this program, please contact the creators of this episode via email or social media as mentioned in the episode.